You're watching WUWT-TV live on the web. Welcome back to WUWT-TV. We're doing a pre-recorded session because Mike Smith, our consulting meteorologist all the way from Wichita, Kansas, couldn't be with us live tonight. But he is going to be joining us by this pre-recorded session. So, hello Mike, how are you?
I'm great, Anthony, and I want to apologize for not being able to be seen live. I'm giving a speech this evening to the North Texas chapter of the American Meteorological Society about the Joplin tornado, but I did want to participate, and thank you for accommodating me by recording this.
Well, it's certainly an honor to have you here. And as I understand it, you were recently appointed to something very special regarding Hurricane Sandy. Is that right?
Yes, I'm the co-lead, along with Nazette Rydell, of the National Weather Service's service assessment for Hurricane Sandy. So we're going to try to find out what went right, what went wrong, and what we can do better the next time.
That's great, Mike. We're going to be talking today about Hurricane Sandy and other types of severe weather all through our broadcast. And during that broadcast, of course, you have your own PowerPoint session, which you're going to be bringing to us. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're going to be talking about?
What I'm going to be talking about is the media hype that Hurricane Sandy was somehow caused by global warming. That's simply not true. We've always had hurricanes, and in the 1950s, when Earth's temperatures were cooler than today, hurricanes along the east coast of the United States were much more frequent than they are now. If anything, and I'm not saying this is the case, but if anything, Earth's warmer temperatures have meant less frequent hurricanes along the east coast of the United States.
That's an interesting premise, and it's totally contrary to what some of the folks who are activists about global warming are saying. Why do you think that is?
Well, I'm not saying it is that way. I'm saying there's no evidence to believe that hurricanes, especially along the East Coast, are getting more frequent because of Earth's current higher temperatures. There's just no evidence, and I'll talk about that in my PowerPoint in just a moment. However, what I think is very important is, regardless of what Earth's temperatures happen to be, we have to build a more resilient society. If, in fact, the people who believe that catastrophic global warming is around the corner are correct, building a more resilient society will serve us well. It will also serve us well if there's a major hurricane not connected to Earth's temperatures, or if there's a tsunami. We have to build a more resilient society.
I agree with that. And in the case of New York, that was one of the problems. They weren't paying attention to the infrastructure up there, and as a result, even what wasn't even a hurricane when it made landfall. Sandy was a hurricane out at sea, but when it made landfall, it was an extratropical cyclone. Storm surge was enough to overwhelm the infrastructure that they didn't pay attention to. Does that pretty much agree with your assessment?
Well, let me back up and say I don't know whether Sandy was a hurricane at landfall or not. That's one of the things our group is going to be looking at. So I don't want to pass judgment on that today. That said, the storm surge in New York City was approximately equal to what New York has in its emergency plan for a Category 2 hurricane. So this was a major storm surge, and New York was not well prepared based on media reports. Now, again, let me say, that's something that our group is going to be looking at, and it may prove that New York was prepared in ways that I'm not aware of right now. I'm completely open-minded about it, but based on media reports, it appears that New York was somewhat caught off guard.
Well, as I understand it, just before Sandy made landfall, NHC declared it an extratropical cyclone. Is that not the case now, or do you not know?
They were still issuing hurricane bulletins when Sandy was making landfall. So that would seem to indicate they thought it was a hurricane. But again, that's something our group is going to be looking at and will be reporting on when our investigation and compilation is complete.
Okay, Mike. Well, what we're going to do right now is we're going to go to your PowerPoint presentation. And at this point, Mike's going to be trying out something that we've invented here just for this program. It's a remote clicker. Well, I've set it up so on his Macintosh in Wichita, he can click a web page and make his slideshow advance, which we've got loaded into our computer here. And we tried it earlier and it worked great. So this will be our first test of it. So we're going to see how that works. And I'm going to switch you over right now to the PowerPoint. And it's all yours, Mike.
All right, Anthony, let's take a look. First of all, these are Earth's temperatures for the last 15 years. Now, if we highlight that area, you can see that essentially for the last decade and a half, Earth's temperatures have been flat. Now, this is a commonly used index of Earth's temperatures that is scientifically accepted. So if Earth's temperatures are not rising, that means that global warming has stopped. Now, will it start again next year? Will temperatures start cooling next year? I have no idea, neither does anyone else. This pause in global warming has been unexpected if you go back and read the IPCC and other reports on the subject. So given that temperatures have flattened, while they are at a high level, right now global warming has ceased. All right, so given that we have a high level of temperatures, what has that meant in terms of extreme weather? Well, let's take a look at tornadoes. As many of our viewers know, tornadoes are rated on what is called the Fujita scale, which is a scale with 0 and 1 being the lowest and 5 being the highest. F5 tornadoes are the rarest. Less than 0.5% of all tornadoes reach F5 intensity. Now, there is no question that the total number of tornadoes in the last 50 years is way up. Why is that? Well, we have Doppler radar, which allows us to see the smaller tornadoes we didn't used to be able to see. And now we have storm chasers who use that Doppler radar to get into the right place at the right time. And now small tornadoes that never used to make it into the record book get into the records that simply weren't observed, especially at night, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So total number of tornadoes is up, but I don't think we can attribute that to global warming. If we look at the major tornadoes, the ones that are most likely to cause deaths, injuries, and major destruction, the F3, F4, and F5s, you can see from this graphic compiled by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administrations that if anything, the frequency of major tornadoes is down. Yes, 2011 was a very big year, but you can see it's an outlier. Other recent years are much lower, and they're lower than they were back in the 50s and 60s. So there's absolutely no evidence to indicate that, at least in the United States, damaging tornadoes are increasing because of global warming. Now let's take a look at hurricanes, and by the way, this does include the data for Hurricane Sandy. This is as of October 31st. You can see the total number of tropical storms and hurricanes worldwide is not up as of 2005.
Mike,
Now,
if I can interject here, if you could explain what this graph source is.
Sure. The source of this is Dr. Ryan Ma, who, as you and I know, has a PhD in tropical meteorology from Florida State University. And he has been compiling this data for years. It goes back to 1979, but it can only go back to 1979 because that's when we had worldwide satellite coverage for hurricanes. And so what we see here is tropical storms are on top, hurricanes are on the bottom. And if you go back to when this data begins, you see there's no real upward trend in either tropical storm or hurricane frequency worldwide. But I think the next slide is even more important. And what that slide shows is that we have no upward trend in hurricane strength. Now this goes back, let's look at that little peak where it says 05 and 06. That's back when the United States had Katrina, Rita, and Wilma, three very powerful hurricanes to hit our coast. If you'll recall from the news coverage back in that time period, it was Hurricanes are on an upward trend and they're going to increase, they're going to increase, they're going to be more severe, they're going to be more of them, and quite the opposite has happened. Worldwide hurricane strength is down, and you can see that graph goes down to the present time. In addition, although it's hard to believe with Sandy, Sandy was at most a Category 2 hurricane when it was off the U.S. coast. Whether it was a 1 or 2, don't know yet, might have briefly reached Category 2 intensity. But here's the interesting thing. Major hurricanes are defined as Category 3, 4, or 5 on the Saffir-Simpson scale. Well, we are at a record. Every single day, we add one more day to the record length of time since a Category 3 hit our coast. That record goes back to the year 1900 when the Galveston hurricane occurred. We are in a hurricane drought in spite of Hurricane Sandy.
And if I recall correctly, Mike, it's over 2,500 days now that we are in that drought.
Yes, it is. We are in a hurricane drought at the moment. So there's absolutely no evidence that the frequency or intensity of tornadoes or hurricanes in the United States is going up as a result of global warming. That's pure hype.
So, Mike, what are we going to be doing then in terms of mitigating some of the hype that's out there? How are we going to counter that?
Well, I don't see that it's my job to counter hype. My job is good science. And I want to go wherever the science takes me. And if 20 years from now the numbers of hurricanes are up, the numbers of tornadoes are up, then we may have to take a second look at it. I do believe that on balance, human beings do warm the climate, but I see nothing catastrophic about it. I see nothing quick about it. I believe the traditional, and I hate to use this term, logarithmic relationship between CO2 concentrations and atmospheric temperatures is correct. Now, what do I mean by a logarithmic relationship? The way I try to explain that is what I call the hot tub analogy. If you have a hot tub where you want to trap the warm water, you might put 1 inch of insulation over it. And if you want to trap more heat, you put a 2nd inch of insulation over it. But eventually, after a point, the 20th, 21st, 23rd inch of insulation is going to trap less heat than that 1st and 2nd inch. That's a logarithmic relationship, and that's what I believe we have based on the best scientific evidence with CO2 rather than a direct relationship as the IPCC hypothesizes.
Well, Mike, we've got a situation where we've always got the same story in the media where they say storms are increasing, and they're increasing because of, as Al Gore calls it, dirty weather. Dirty energy equals dirty weather. That's his moniker right now. That's what he's pushing. And we see other activists like Bill McKibben going out and pushing the same kind of connection. How is it that if we have a little bit of global warming, as you say, some portion of it, how is it that these folks are trying to connect these things together? I mean, is there any credible link between these things at all, between increased carbon dioxide, a small rise in temperature, and an increase in the frequency of severe storms, be it hurricanes or tornadoes or cumulonimbus type storms? Can you see any connection at all?
No, I don't. I don't see any connection at this point. Now, I'm open-minded, and if the good scientific literature shows a connection in the future, that's fine. You know, you mentioned Al Gore. Glenn Reynolds, who blogs at Instapundit, has a great line that I've stolen from him and use occasionally, and that is that I'll believe global warming is a crisis when the people who are telling me it's a crisis start acting like it's a crisis. Al Gore flies around on business jets. Now, I have no problem with business jets. Heck, I would gladly have one if I could afford it. But Al Gore flies around on business jets, has 7 homes, has a yacht. He has a carbon footprint the size of some small nations. Yet he's telling the rest of us that we need to decrease our carbon footprint. And that's true of so many global advocates, and the media just gives them a pass. It seems to be that if you believe in global warming but don't practice what you preach, That hypocrisy is never called out by the media. If Al Gore really believed that this crisis existed, he would stop flying on corporate jets, he would give up some of the mansions and would give up the yacht and cut down on his carbon footprint.
I'd like to point out, Mike, and not to say anything bad about where you're at, but where you're at right now does not look like a castle or a palace built by big oil. And I would point out that neither does mine. I mean, we're living in regular surroundings here. Neither of us have corporate jets or a fleet of cars or a collection of homes or a bevy of boats. We're just pretty much average Joes that see something that we think is wrong. I think that in your case you would agree with that. You think what's being pushed out there is wrong, and we're trying to correct it.
Well, I own one home. It's a nice home, and by world standards, I'm very well off. I'm worried about poverty in the third world. There's no question that energy use equals prosperity. And if some of the draconian measures are put in place that some of the pro global warming alarmists want, we are condemning the third world to infinite poverty. And I have a moral problem with that. Yes, I have a nice home, but I have a single home. I drive a Ford Taurus. I don't have a yacht, and I don't have a private airplane. I have no problem with people who have those things. That's just fine. But then don't be preaching to me about the size of my carbon footprint.
In the institutions that are connected with meteorology, we have seen institutions like the American Meteorological Society, the American Chemical Society, the American Physical Society, and other different societies come out and endorse global warming as pretty much a cause of all the woes that we have going on in the atmosphere today. How do you feel about some of those endorsements, particularly the AMS, to take one off?
Well, I think I'm a little distressed by some of the things the AMS has done in this area. I try, Anthony, not to talk about politics. I don't talk about it on my blog. I make an exception for Al Gore because the level of hypocrisy there is just off the charts. But I'd rather not talk about politics. I prefer to be known for science. And I have children. I don't have grandchildren yet, but I hope to someday. And I want to leave a very livable earth to them. And part of a livable earth includes responsible use of energy, but that energy is reasonably plentiful, not just in the United States and not just in the first world, but all over the world. I want to lift everyone out of poverty.
That's an excellent goal. And, you know, there's this view, I think, that's out there of people like you and me that are out there questioning some of the claims that we don't care about people. We don't care about the earth, or we don't care about the future, or we don't care about our grandchildren. I keep seeing these memes repeated again and again. But the fact of the matter is as by your own definition, you care greatly. And I just want to say, you know, I have an electric car. I have solar on my home. Actually, I've done 3 solar projects now. And I care about the future, which is why I'm involved in this. I want our future to be prosperous, don't you?
Yes, I have a good friend who does work for some of the large environmental groups, and that's great. And what he says to me, he says, Mike, you are an environmentalist in the Barry Goldwater mode when it was called conservationist. And I proudly agree with him. I don't want to waste resources. I don't want to gratuitously pollute the earth. That would be silly. But human beings, by definition, have to produce energy if we're going to avoid going back to caves and the Stone Age. So I want to do it in a judicious, smart, efficient manner. But the idea that we should somehow have draconian cuts in energy production is wrong-headed as far as I'm concerned.
I understand. And I would like to ask you a little bit more about this upcoming commission to study Hurricane Sandy. Now, as I understand it, you're going to be gathering all of the data from all the different sources and then poring over the results, trying to make a determination. First of all, who commissioned this? And was there any kind of a expectation of any kind of an outcome that was put into the charge for the committee?
The written charge has absolutely no preferred outcome. It was commissioned by the National Weather Service. I was asked to serve as co-chair because I believe it was felt that I would be objective, and it will take months for us to do this. Now, I really can't say anything more, Anthony, because we are now in what's called our silence period. Work has begun, and I could say anything I wanted to before our work started, and I can say anything I want to after. I can talk about whether I think it was a fair and objective study or not. But I am not supposed to, for very good reason, talk about our data gathering and who we're talking to and why we're talking to them, because we do not want to bias the results.
I understand that. This storm, though, was particularly well watched because of technology advances that have happened in recent years and so forth. Would you say that this storm probably had more eyes on it, more data being made on it, and more observations, more eyes in the sky and eyes on the ground than any other storm we've seen in American history?
No question. The National Weather Service made a very gutsy call to collect additional data on this storm. Now, one of the things we're going to look at is, did that help? I don't know yet, but the National Weather Service made a gutsy call. I think one of the things we need to get across to the public is that the quality of storm warnings, hurricanes, tornadoes, blizzards, ice storm, has skyrocketed the last decade. I think John Q. Public realizes just how good storm warnings have become. So they then discount the warnings. And if you go back and look at my blog, which is mikesmithenterprises.com/blog, and go back and look at the run up to Sandy, and there is excellent advice. Fill your gas tank. Go to the ATM and get lots of cash. Get a power inverter for your car, or if you can afford it, a generator. Fill the generator with gas in advance. Fill lawnmower cans with gasoline. If you go back and look at that advice, it was right on the money. Now, I'm not trying to pat myself on the back, because other meteorologists were saying the same thing. We've got to understand that you now ignore storm warnings at your peril because they're very good quality. And if I may say, Anthony, I've written a book on that subject called Warnings: The True Story of How Science Tamed the Weather. And we did tame Sandy. The forecasts were there. If people chose to follow the advice, there's no question they could have mitigated or tamed the effect that Sandy had on their lives.
I've read that book that you've written, Mike. It's an excellent book. And one of the things that I noted myself, but also I saw that you note in the book, is that the public is going through, in some cases, warnings fatigue. They're getting way too many warnings sometimes for things that don't necessarily affect them or materialize within their sphere of influence. And so it's, for them, it's a bit of a cry wolf problem. How do we deal with that in the future so that the public pays more attention?
Well, let me give you an example. Here in Wichita, we had a very damaging tornado on April 14th of this year that was extremely well forecast. Everyone knew on Friday that we may have tornadoes in Wichita Saturday evening. I mean, it was extremely well publicized. Then, 40 minutes before the tornado arrived, a tornado warning was issued for Sedgwick County and the city of Wichita. And indeed, an F3 tornado caused north of $250 million in damage. But you know what? There were people in West Wichita and downtown Wichita who complained because the sirens went off in their area, but their neighborhood wasn't hit. I think we have to be very careful about our expectations. We're not going to be able, at least for the foreseeable future, to tell you what neighborhoods and what blocks are going to be hit by a tornado. Yes, Northwest Wichita was not in the tornado warning and they were not hit. But most of the city was in the tornado warning because we're not precise enough that we can get it down to, well, it's going to hit the corner of Rock Road and 47th Street. We're just not there yet. Maybe someday we will. So I think it's important for people to have realistic expectations about the warnings. But it was an excellent warning and it saved lives. Even though we had an F3 tornado in a densely populated area, there was not a single fatality, nor was there a single serious injury. That is taming the weather.
That's an excellent record to be proud of in terms of forecasting and warnings. Back to what you were talking about, not being able to forecast or warn for a tornado or thunderstorm down to the block level. We have a kind of a perception now that's on television, and I've noted this, and I don't subscribe to it myself. I've always thought it was a bit misleading. I don't know how you feel about it, but there's this big deal about street level Doppler, which seems to be everywhere. And for me, it just seems to be nothing more than an interpolation, a blob interpolation that really may or may not be all that accurate. How do you feel about it?
Uh, like everything else, it's got its good points and its bad points. The good point is that by putting a hook echo or a Doppler velocity couplet, both of which are signatures of tornadoes, over a street map, you get a good idea of what part of town is affected. Now, that hook echo may have a diameter of 2 or 3 miles, so we're not down to the block, but at least you're not telling the opposite side of town they're threatened when they're really not. Now, that said, it is silly to say that we can forecast where the tornado is going to go down to a block. Maybe we will be someday able to do that, but we can't now.
There's been advances in the National Weather Service with something called the dual polarization Doppler, which they are now deploying. How do you feel about that in terms of being able to make the radar image and the forecast a little more granular, a little tighter?
There is a signature of a tornado called a debris signature that can only be seen on dual polarization radar. And if we have a debris signature, there is virtually a 100% chance there's a tornado on the ground. And at night, that's extremely important information, extremely important. So in and of itself, that's a step forward. We're still learning how to differentiate the size of hail and the rates of rainfall to improve the accuracy of severe thunderstorm warnings and flash flood warnings. I have no doubt that 5 years from now, those types of warnings, flash flood and hail, will be more accurate than they are now as a result of dual polarization radar, but we're just not there yet. It's kind of like the early days of the Doppler wind data. We badly overwarned of tornadoes because every single swirl we saw we thought indicated a tornado.
Well, people were seeing red and green everywhere, weren't they?
As our knowledge level about how to use the Doppler radar tool advanced, we realized that minor swirls aren't a threat. It's exactly the same problem as radiologists had with breast cancer. When the new generation of digital mammograms came in, there were far too many false positives, women being told they had breast cancer who didn't because the instrument was much more sensitive. And so eventually radiologists learned to calibrate what they were telling women based on this new capability, and we're going to have to go through the same curve with dual polarization radar that we did with Doppler radar.
The upcoming technology boon that we're going to be seeing with dual polarization radar might be coupled with more precise warnings. How do you think the Weather Service might be able to change or adapt so that people don't get some of that leftover warning fatigue applied to that? Because at that point, the warnings are going to be more precise and they should be heeded more with more zeal. But that may not happen because of the warning fatigue. How would we overcome that?
I have no doubt that that's something we're going to be looking at in the Hurricane Sandy. Did Irene cause warning fatigue? I don't know. But I have no doubt that's something we're going to look at and a question we're going to have to answer. It's an excellent question, Anthony. I just don't have the answer yet.
Okay, Mike, we're coming up on the half hour here for your time slot. Are there any final thoughts that you want to add before we go?
Yes, it is entirely possible to be an environmentalist and want to conserve Earth and its resources, but not believe in catastrophic global warming. Number two, it is extremely important that we build a more resilient and more sustainable society. That will serve us well, regardless of whether Earth's temperatures go up, down, or stay the same. And finally, it is very important for your safety and the safety of your family to heed storm warnings. Yeah, once in a while, You may go to the basement when it's not necessary, and once every 5 years you may evacuate inland, and you ended up not needing to. But the level of accuracy is such that we ignore storm warnings at our peril.
Good advice, Mike. And I guess the way to sum that up is it's better to be safe than sorry. Well, that concludes our time with you here on WUWT-TV. Thank you for being here with us all the way from Wichita, and thank you for being our first tester of this broadcast. Even though this is appearing later in the broadcast, Mike is actually the first. He's always been on the forefront of technology, so he's on the forefront of this test here, and he's helping me get this thing ironed out. And as you saw, there was a couple little glitches in the early part of it, but we think we got it nailed down. Again, Mike, thanks for being with us, and thank you for watching WUWT-TV. We'll resume in just a couple of minutes after the intermission.